Well, then let's go ahead. I'm very excited about our speaker tonight, another mammologist, Chris Ray, Dr. Chris Ray. She was an undergrad at the University of California at San Diego, where Michael Soule, some of you may know him, he's kind of the father, one of the fathers of conservation biology. So she was in a class, I think, and he said, does anybody want to go to Montana and study pikas? And were you the only one? One of few, or the only one who raised her hand. So she didn't even know what a pika was at the time. And the rest is history, but I'll tell you a little more. She then went on to the University of California at Davis to get her PhD in actually population biology, which of course is a really important field for pikas now as we're trying to sort out how they're dealing with climate change. She is now at the Institute for Arctic and Alpine Research, INSTAR, and also at an organization in California studying bird population trends, which she has been doing for the past 10 years. And we heard a little bit about that at dinner, and that's pretty interesting as well. She is a scientific advisor for the Pika Citizen Science Project. Some of you may have gone out on that, and it's a growing project. It's just fantastic, trying to look at where pikas are maintaining their populations on these, isolated, sometimes difficult to get to areas. And then a most disconcerting thing, and she's the third person that I know of, was attacked by a moose in September. She broke 3 vertebrae, her ribs and her sternum, and she hurt her ankle. I don't even know what the latest is on that. She tripped over barbed wire on the ground, and so she was lying down, and the moose jumped and stomped on her. Then before she went away, before she could move away, came back and stomped on her again. It's really hard to imagine, just really. So we're so glad she's vertical, even though she's sitting right now, she's vertical and can give this talk. And then I have to share with you a wonderful comment she made the first time she met. I also did my PhD on pikas on Niwot Ridge, which she'll be talking about. That's one of her study areas now. And so we met for lunch, and she just made this comment I love about having the memory of a gnat. And don't we all feel that way sometimes? So I love that. Chris, without any further ado, I'd like you to come and take over.
Okay, thank you. I'm really glad you mentioned the thing about memory of a gnat, because that way, if I forget what I'm saying next, you guys will all know why. Yeah.
Does anybody know the lights?
Does that happen a lot here? That horrible
The feedback
sound. Is it because this mic is on?
Yeah. No, I turned this one off.
No, I mean this one that I'm near. Like, can you turn this one off? Because I don't know how to do it and I don't want to get close to it.
It's not on.
It isn't. Okay. Well, I'm just special, I guess. I don't know. Maybe this one's on. No, they're off. Okay.
Okay.
I turned the gain down a little bit. Just try again.
Thank you. I love the voice from above. Awesome. All right, so you may have seen the little blurb for this talk, where I sort of posed this bit of a conundrum about pikas, and I titled the talk "A Tale of Two Pikas" because it's about this conundrum. We have here an animal, it's about a bit as big as your fist, that it has been kind of a poster child for the bad effects of climate change, and yet this animal, it lives in some of the harshest places on the planet, some places that you wouldn't imagine. And I'm not, unfortunately, going to talk about these today, so I'll talk about them right now. There's not going to be any slides, but these pikas, you're probably most used to them up at high elevation places that stay really cold most of the year. But they can actually live in lava beds. So literally, these places that might be 170 degrees Fahrenheit on the ground, black lava, and you'll see a pika out there and you'll think, what the heck? How are they gonna, why is global warming a problem if they can live on that? It turns out that the exception proves the rule. The lava beds tend to have ice underneath them. So they have cracks in that old dried lava. Water gets down in there. The rock is very glassy, very well insulating, and the water freezes underneath there and can be ice. And so there's a microclimate under the surface that the pikas can use to cool off. And that's how they live in lava beds. Most places where pikas need to live are high elevation, because that's where a freeze thaw process that makes these rocks that pikas get into, and we'll just talk more about that. But the reason that I made this silly slide that I thought would look really cool, and it kind of looks creepy instead, but sorry about that. It was just a little creative moment. Is that there's this duality between, you know, the spunkiness and the amazing ability of these animals to survive in these all kinds of habitats, and their vulnerability to climate change. And this work has been done by me, and oh, of course, as soon as I want to actually use this thing, it worked in there. And a lot of students, okay? So thanks ahead of time to all the students who have worked with me. This is not half of them. I don't have room for them all on slides in a way that you'd see their beautiful faces. But yeah, that and the fact that actually this organization and other organizations that some of you in the room belong to have supported these wonderful students who have gone on to amazing things. And I really appreciate all that. And our other funders as well, who are at the bottom of the page. So what it all comes down to is that this little thing that's about as big as your fist, it doesn't hibernate. And that seems kind of crazy because, boy, the winter is long and cold, and why would you not hibernate? But a pika is related to the rabbits and hares, and none of them hibernate. Pika is a little different, though, as you can see. They have a very small size. They have shrunk their little ears so that they don't lose heat the way the rabbit and hare ears do. They have shrunk their little legs so that they can tuck up underneath really tight and make a little fuzzy ball. They look kind of like a tennis ball covered with rabbit fur. And a sphere covered with rabbit fur is about as good as you can get in terms of retaining heat. So you can just see by looking at this animal that it has spent a lot of evolutionary history trying to get good at retaining heat. That's kind of interesting because we think of it as being so vulnerable to getting too hot. But most of the year, where most of the places these animals live, it's really cold a lot. And so they're really shaped to retain the heat. So they don't hibernate, even though they live on ice. And this is another, well, I'm afraid if I get close to that, I think it's a problem. I'll stay over here. So there's a couple papers by Dave Hafner in the early 90s where he showed on the left-hand side the distribution of the American pika in our area. And then another paper where he showed on the right-hand side the distribution of permafrost. And they look really, really similar. And he pointed this out, that pikas really like to live at a place that's 0 degrees for most of the year. That's what they're built for. About right at freezing is where they're most comfortable. And actually lots of small animals are comfortable right at freezing. That they can handle. But getting below that is less conducive. So I think about this a lot because I live at 9,000 feet right next to Niwot Ridge. I live there all year. It's not a good idea. I've lived there for 20 years, and at first it was really thrilling and wonderful, and it still is. But every year I learn a little more about why people don't do that or didn't in our evolutionary history. We did not live at 9,000 feet here in the Rockies. It's not so great. And so if you stand at my house and you turn and look the other direction, you see Niwot Ridge. That's the view. And Niwot Ridge is really hellacious. A lot of winter days. They look like this. This is what it looked like last week. And the pikas, they're just sitting there with no house at all. And they're doing fine, pretty much. They're still on Niwot Ridge, which is great. I'll talk about some places where they aren't anymore, but we're doing pretty good around here. Pikas are built to retain heat. As I mentioned before, here we have the tennis ball with the rabbit fur on it. And you can see how the little feet can tuck right up underneath in the ball, and it can maintain everything it's got. This is a graph that I stole. I didn't show very many graphs in this talk, but this one I think is worth looking at. It's just phenomenal how what we have here is on the x-axis, we have the body mass, how big is the animal? And then on the y-axis, we have the metabolic rate, which basically tells you how well it generates heat, how fast and how much. And wow, most animals are really tight on that line. It's such a cool line. And so I put the pika on there at its weight and its metabolic rate, and it's just like almost off the chart. You know, it's way off. It is the most weird animal in the world in terms of being not on this line. And so they're super good at generating this heat and then retaining it. So that means that evolution's been telling them they have to, right? So they generate heat through this high metabolic rate, and then they retain it through low thermal conductance by having this nice fur. And then for any animal, not let alone small animals, any animal, winters can be colder where there's less snow. And we know this as people because we're lumbering around above the snow in the wintertime, and we're up in the often sub-freezing temperatures in the air. Whereas all those small animals, well, they just go down underneath the snow and they're at zero, which is just fine for them. And it would be for us too, of course. Most of you know that if you're really in trouble, you dig a snow cave and you're in there and you could probably survive. But if there's no snow, you can't do that. And the other animals have this trouble too. They have to have that snow. The low thermal conductance, well, part of it is your fur and the other part is the snow. You got to have it and get underneath there. So that's how they're surviving in a lot of these places. And in fact, pikas are disappearing from cold places with little snow. We're getting less snow in a lot of places, especially throughout the West. And that's where pikas are disappearing. Luckily, right around here in Niwot, we still have healthy snow. But we also have the flip side of the problem. When you have a high metabolic rate, you generate heat just as well in the summertime. And so if it gets too hot in the summer, it's really difficult to do all those activities that you need to do in the summer that you can't do in the winter, like forage for food and mate and find a territory and fight and do all those things that mammals do in the summertime. Pikas actually die when they're held at temperatures above 25 C. So that's sort of like you go to the beach, if you get to go to the beach, it's 75 degrees, it's perfect, it's balmy. You could lay there all day, right? A pika would be dead in just a few hours. They're a mammal like you. They supposedly can regulate their body temperature, but they do not have the ability to sweat or pant. They don't have any skin that's not covered with fur to release heat. They're just in a bad way. So they have to live near a refrigerator and be able to get in it and cool off sometime during the day to shed heat passively. Populations are disappearing also where summers are warmer. And then there's this problem. As a scientist, you're trying to figure out, well, which is it? It's a two pika problem again. Is it the summer that's too hot or is it the winter that's too cold? And it'd be nice to know, but unfortunately those two things are correlated, right? If you have warmer summers, you usually have less snow in the winter. And so the habitats the little animals in are actually colder. So it's a problem. And climate change can deliver the 1-2 punch. Like I just said, warmer summers and colder snow-free winters, and pikas out. So pikas need the winter food cache, and that thing is tough to build. You can see this is actually a female pika. We can't tell the sex by looking at them, but I happen to know this one because I trapped it later. So she's sitting on her hay pile, which isn't as big as it's going to be. It's going to be probably in the end enough hay to fill this whole thing here. Every year she's got to get that going. Sometime in the late summer she starts, after she's finished nursing all of her babies, and then she starts collecting this hay pile. And by late September it better be done because the snow is going to be covering everything up. All the vegetation's all senescent, and so she's going to do something that I've heard termed, it's like you going to the store, putting 3 cabbages in your mouth and running home 1,000 times. That's what she's got to do. And meanwhile, she's got to look out for foxes and whatever, on the way as she's running back and forth. This is something we rarely see. This is the only melanistic pika that I've seen a picture of in North America. In Asia, there are some species where they're melanistic all the time, dark individuals, but the American pika, for whatever reason, doesn't have this very often. This is the only one. Well, that probably right there tells you that they're physiologically maybe on the edge. This animal might get a little bit warmer than it needs to, and it's not going to be selected for in this population. This guy, however, lived for 4 years, and I got to trap him. Didn't have to put tags on him, did I? Nice. He was great. And I'm using a picture of him not only because he's the cutest one ever, but because he showed us just how energetic pikas get in the summertime collecting their food. His hay pile site was right next to an aspen tree, and you would have thought he was a bear cub, where he would climb that tree to get leaves and put them in his hay pile. So yeah, he was awesome. They're born in the springtime, usually before the snows are off. It takes about 3 weeks for them to be weaned, and then they show up on the top of the talus, and they look kind of like a golf ball with fur on it, and they're tiny little things. And then they might come up in June or something, and by September they have to have dispersed, find a good territory that they don't get thrown out of, defend it, start making a hay pile. Before the snow flies, they got to have this hay pile. That is not very likely. So most pikas don't make it through their first year. But if they do, and they find a good territory, I've had individuals live as long as 9 years tagged. So if they get a good territory, they're golden. And they could be a weasel living right next door, or they can be pine martens living right next door, and they can survive for years with that. They're quite amazing. They fight, they box like hares. This is what happens if you trap a pika and you keep it out of its territory for a few hours, then you bring it back. Sometimes it has to fight and get it back. This one wasn't one of those, but pretty neat. So if summers are too hot for that dispersal and the foraging, and then a winter's too cold, you can end up losing animals. This is a preview of one of the predictions that we've made. This one is for Rocky Mountain National Park, and I didn't put the boundary on here because it kind of clutters things up too much. But this is the entire park, and what you see in red are areas where it's good for pikas. High occupancy of taluses in the park look red. And on the left-hand side, we see what things look like now, where pikas occur way over on the left, where there's the Never Summer Range, that little thin thing on the left. And then all throughout the park, from north of Mount Chapin all the way down south to Wild Basin, pikas all over the place. But if you look out toward the end of the century, we have a huge diminishing of habitats that we think will support pikas based on our modeling. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the modeling later, but mainly we see this and we're like, oh my God, you're kidding. Rocky Mountain National Park. I mean, pikas are pretty iconic there. How could they possibly disappear in this century? Maybe we got it wrong. That's something I worry about all the time. So this is what we're studying, trying to figure out, is this a good prediction, a bad prediction? What? And what's driving that, Like the models are just correlating where pikas are now with climate, and then looking at how the climate's going to change, and therefore, quote unquote, how pikas are going to change, how their distribution is going to change. But what about the mechanism? Here's a hypothesis. Will hay piling fail them? If they have to spend all this energy in the summer to make hay to keep enough calories in them over the winter to survive, maybe they're going to be doomed because they've got to spend too much energy in the summer, and they'll be too hot and they'll just keel over. Literally of heat stroke. So who knows? They've got this amazing behavior, but maybe it will doom them eventually. hay piles are just amazing. I mean, doesn't this look delicious? Like a wonderful pica salad. Actually, a lot of these plants are highly toxic to us. The pica gets to put them in a hay pile, and as soon as it clips them and they stick them under the rock there, they start losing those toxic compounds. They start degrading, and then the nutrients that are in those toxic compounds become available to them, and they're more palatable, and then they get to eat it for the rest of the winter. So that's not something we normally do. Normally we cook it, and that's how we get it. Picas didn't think of that yet. Picas are good for more than nutrition, however. What's really cool about hay piles is there's nothing else that makes anything like this. A wood rat midden does not look like this. Nothing looks like this. So when we see things like this on the left-hand side, which is an old pica hay pile, we know picas were there. And another reason we know they were there is that because the resources that they collected are all in one place, they poop there a lot. And their poop, being rabbit poop, is highly resistant to decay because rabbits run their food through twice. Right? They do not have rumens and stuff. They're eating really low quality vegetation, grasses, leaves, just like a cow or something, but they don't have all those extra stomachs. And so they actually literally run it through once, grab it, comes out, looks like Vegemite, probably tastes about like Vegemite, I don't know. And they eat it. And then the second time it comes out, it's that little round rabbit pellet, only it's just the size of a peppercorn. So it's clearly not a rabbit. And so we can find those pellets. Nothing else is eating them because there's no nutrients left in them. And we find them for decades. People have radiocarbon dated these pellets and found pellets that are 60, 90 years old out in the desert. It's pretty awesome. So we can use the hay piles and the scats to figure out where picas were and where they're not anymore. Like, it's pure evidence, right? So we go out, say, in the Great Basin. This is a wonderful image from space of the Great Basin. This is not an artist rendering, really. It's gorgeous, though. All those mountain ranges in Nevada, they all used to have picas on them. We know because of wood rat middens. They find the pica pellets collected in those. But 10,000 years ago, picas were everywhere, and they've been slowly going extinct on different mountain ranges. And so one of the first papers that I wrote about picas was with Eric Beaver in 2010, and we documented some recent extinctions. So when we look at this image of the Great Basin, we've got some squares on there. Those are prehistoric pica locations where picas are no longer. Those are the white squares. The white dots, which might look a lot like squares at your distance, those are where picas are persisting right now. And then the black triangles are places where picas have recently gone extinct, meaning in the last few decades. And there's a lot of those places where they have just been totally lost from the landscape for kilometers around them, and they're just gone. So we saw this, and we found that, oh, sure enough, those are the places that are warmer in the summer and colder in the winter or lacking snow. We put temperature sensors in the rocks and found that they were colder in the winter because of the lack of snow. So that's where picas are disappearing now. Now, what about all the predictions? I showed you one prediction that was from my group. That's going to show up on this slide next, plus predictions of some other people. And our predictions of where they're going to go extinct next are pretty dramatic. Basically everywhere. Stewart et al. Predicted they'd go extinct in the Sierra Nevadas. We're talking about losses in the Rocky Mountains. It kind of just depends on how you project the climate. So we have this problem. Supposedly they're going out. Let's look at Rocky Mountain a little more closely, because now I'm here in this area and studying this in more detail. And the coolest thing about Rocky is that we actually documented in our study that there are two subspecies that are hybridizing. Everybody knew there were at least two subspecies in the park, but the graduate student that we hired on this project found that they're actually hybridizing right along Trail Ridge Road. Pretty cool. So that is maybe an ace up their sleeve. If they had sleeves, they would have this ace up there, because a place where hybrids are can be a place of great greater genetic diversity, maybe an ability to adapt to climate change a little bit better than other places because they have more going on in their genetics. It also could be, however, a population sink. I mean, you've heard of hybrid vigor, but there's also outbreeding depression. And so we don't know what is it gonna be? Is it one or the other? Is it changing? And that's another thing that we're studying. But first, what I would like Mike to do, are you still there with us, Mike?
I am.
Is there any chance on your computer that you could play the different sounds that these two pikas make? Can you play the blue one? It worked. So that's the northern subspecies, Okatona princeps. And now how about the southern one? More of a spray. The northern one is more plaintive. Sounds like it's pissed off or upset or something. The southern one sounds like it's in your face. You know, like, get out, go. They sound different enough that we can actually use the sounds to figure out what subspecies they are. And it turns out that a wonderful guy named Preston Summers, back in the late 60s, early 70s, went into this whole area and took recordings, and he thought, oh, I can tell what's a hybrid too. The hybrids are intermediate in how they sound. And if you diagram it all out, they're literally intermediate. So then he took some and he put them in his backyard in Durango. He made underground boxes for them to go in. And 4 years he had pikas there. And he actually got some of the northern to mate with the southern. And sure enough, even though the offspring could hear all the pikas, could hear the northern dialect and the southern dialect, they had the intermediate. And the ones that weren't, the offspring that weren't hybrids, had their parents call. So he proved that way that it's probably genetic, not the learned behavior in terms of their song. So song, I mean, pikas are one of the only small mammals that have a song. The males actually have a long call that we call a song, and they use it a lot like birds do. We won't go there. It's not the right audience for it. Probably won't fall for my reasoning, but anyway. So we're going to be we're going to use these different songs, and then it also turns out that juveniles sound different than adults. So we can figure out if it's a hybrid and if it's a juvenile or an adult. And so we can figure out whether or not it's a sink or a source of pikas, because we can figure out whether or not, oh, do we have survival to juvenile stage of hybrids? Do we have survival to adult stage of hybrids? And then what's the frequency of those in the landscape? So we're going to be doing all that with one of the graduate students. Pretty awesome. So we're going to try to solve that question of whether or not pikas have it there or not. Oh, now it turns out when I hit this, I think we're past it. And speaking of what they have in terms of genetic ace up the sleeve, what we found in that previous project, which was this was published here in 2016. So the work was done actually back in 2012. And we found that the northern subspecies, when you look at how it moves through the landscape based on how related the populations are across the park, it looks something like this. The red places are places pikas can't move through. Those are the lowlands, the valleys. The blue places are places where pikas can move through. Those are all the high points. That's what the northern subspecies looks like in terms of, we call it the resistance of the landscape to pikas moving around. So now let's look at the southern subspecies and see if it looks anything like that. Oh, it's quite different, isn't it? So the southern subspecies can move a lot more easily through the landscape. However, if you actually look closely, I think this one actually has a little, I'm going to try to use, ooh, I didn't like that. I thought that was the pointer. Oh, here it is. No,
Pointer is the big button in the middle.
Oh, yeah, thank you. All right, so I don't know. There's a little bit of a pointer there. Okay. So if we look at this feature here on the left, that's a south-facing slope. And so is this one, it's here too. Pike is actually in that park and in other parks. We studied 8 national parks in this study. They had trouble moving across south-facing slopes. And that's because they disperse as juveniles during their first summer. It has to be during the summer. You can't do it during the winter. They'd be trying to flounder over snow and they don't have big rabbit feet, so it wouldn't work. So they're trying to go and they won't go across these hot places. That makes sense. So this is a general pattern for pikas, and there's some similarity here, but I'm heartened in that these guys are a little bit different, and so that means they have more genetic diversity to work with in this area. However, we could see that they didn't move very well across south-facing slopes, and so it led to our predictions. We found that they're disappearing from warmer places in the summer, places that are colder in the winter, and they don't move very well across south-facing slopes. And we ended up with this in the model, downward spiral in the park, where we don't have very many pikas at the end of the century. So we're still trying to answer that question. Is there any evidence locally that this could be happening? Well, one place we study is Niwot Ridge, because I live near there, right? And so right now you're looking at a bird's eye view of Niwot Ridge. You're looking at the bird's eye view in particular of a place called the West Knoll, which is where Karen did her dissertation work on pikas. And if we actually look at those hay piles and we rank them according to how old they look to us and how much scat there is around them, whether or not they're fresh this year, or they look like, well, a pika was here, but it could have been 10 years ago. I have no idea. It's really old. I had an undergraduate do this ranking, someone who really didn't know. And this poor person, Karen is now going to, she was tasked with doing a 10 by 10 meter grid over the whole knoll. It's actually quite a large area, and it's not the kind of terrain you want to be doing something like that on. My undergraduate was this 6 foot tall young man, quite athletic. And I had him do a radial thing where he started at the top of the knoll and go in a line straight north, and then another, it looked like a big pizza, on top of it. And every hay pile he intersected, he would rank it as opposed as either historically occupied, who knows when, intermediate, or currently occupied. And this is the pattern that he found. And we can see that it looks like at first glance that pikas only occur now near the top of the knoll, and they used to occur further out. Another interpretation of this pattern, however, might be that the population is good in some years and bad in some years, and it's always at the top of the knoll, but only sometimes does it spread out. And so you'd get this pattern of older ones kind of out here, as long as you weren't surveying right after a great year. It's not too likely, but that's at least, you always have to play devil's advocate when you're a scientist. So I had another student do this 5 years later, and the pattern looked about the same. So probably this is really a shrinkage from when Karen was there to today. There are not as many pikas anymore. Can't wait to talk to you about that. But that's probably what's happening. So there's a little evidence there. Another thing we do is we study on the West Knoll the demography still. So trap some pikas every year, put tags in their ears, weigh them, sex them, figure out, who they are. If they're an adult or a juvenile, you can tell the difference by looking at them. So one thing we can do is we can look at, well, what was...
After accounting for our trapping effort in this way, we find that the number of juveniles recruited into this population has fallen dramatically over time. In the 1980s, they trapped more than 1 juvenile per adult, and now we trap less than half that. Trends with time might be due to many different processes, including subtle changes in our methods, so it's more illuminating to relate recruitment to environmental conditions that don't trend perfectly with time. Summer temperature is an obvious choice, and the favored metric of summer temperature on Niwot Ridge is growing degree days, which is measured with care for a large team of scientists studying plants on the ridge. And juvenile recruitment is explained very well by the number of growing degree days leading up to our trapping each summer. Other metrics of summer temperature are also quite explanatory. Recruitment goes up in cooler summers as young pikas fill territories left vacant by adult mortality. I'll end by acknowledging that year and summer temperature metrics are highly correlated on Niwot Ridge, so it's difficult to determine what's driving these results. But we've ruled out other confounding effects like capture dates and reproductive timing.
Okay, my, oh my. All right, so obviously on that talk, I was on a shorter timetable. Okay, so just to have this up here, we know growing degree days have increased on Niwot Ridge, and so they may as well have time on that axis, and I already showed you one where's time. Karen, back when you were trapping pikas up there, you tended to trap a couple juveniles for every adult trapped. And now we just don't have that anymore. So we're either not getting local recruitment, like the pikas aren't having as many babies up there, or the juveniles that are being born in the general area are not managing to make it to the West Knoll at the rates that they used to. We don't really know what the answer to that is, but that's what's happening on the West Knoll, which is just one little population of pikas. But we do have evidence local that maybe pikas are not doing so well. All right. But they have another ace up another sleeve here. I mean, they like talus. Pikas are better at living in talus than almost anything. And so the talus is an amazing environment. I put these sensors underneath the rocks for many years, and in places where the pikas tend to always be, it will be more stable throughout the year under the rocks there than a laboratory at the university. It's just amazing. These are phenomenal habitats. A moose can't get down in there. We can't get down in there. These little guys can, so maybe they're not even as vulnerable as other animals. Maybe they could just find this stuff and they'll be okay if they're in the taluses. It's one thing that we're trying to study. Talus might slow the process of loss of the cryosphere, which is all the icy stuff on the earth, all the frozen water. So we're trying to figure out if that's the case. This is kind of a cartoon of talus. We've got some rocks sitting on top of soil. You might study them by putting sensors deep and shallow and in the free air and try to understand the exchange of air that's mediated by these rocks. Warm, it's kind of like a chimney. Warm air can go up and go out the top, and cool air pools in it. And so you end up with this kind of heat pump where you've got cooler air right above the soil. And then when the snow melts or whatever, it gets, percolates into the soil, then we can have permafrost or at least seasonal ice underneath taluses that we wouldn't even have in meadows that are adjacent to the talus or whatever. The talus is just an amazing place for making this subsurface microclimate. So they have that other ace up their sleeve. And this is my favorite point in the talk. So I was born in 1964. And in that year, there was a guy named Bob Creer who was studying pikas for his PhD right above Long Lake on the north side of Niwot Ridge in an area that nobody knew where it was by the time I came along, because of course he didn't have GPS back then. And he didn't manage to put township and range in his dissertation, although he was otherwise absolutely detailed. Bob Creer is in the middle of this picture, and his buddies were Jim Benedict on his left and Joyce Gellhorn on the right. And Joyce wrote Song of the Alpine, and Jim Benedict was a gentleman scientist who told us all kinds of stuff about the geomorphology of Niwot Ridge and ecology of lichens and everything. He was an amazing person. He drew a map for Bob Creer. In Bob's dissertation, he drew the map of the study area that Bob was at. And one day I was hiking through the forest and I came out on this talus patch and I was like, oh, it's Bob Creer's study site. I know it because of the shape. And then just a few weeks later, I was at a dinner party and I met this guy named Jim Benedict, who I didn't know him from anybody. And I sat next to him and I was telling him all about, he asked me about what I studied and I told him, and he was interested in pikas. And so I was saying, oh, I found this dissertation, is awesome, by this guy, Harry Robert Creer, and I found his study site. And I said, I couldn't believe it. I saw this map and I came upon it in the forest, and now I'm going to study my pikas there. Because he was studying them there when I was born, and I can now see what's changing. And he said, I drew that map. And I was like, oh, I love you. Thank you so much. I could never, it was awesome. So, so we've been studying there. And on the right-hand side, I got a picture of a stick. It's actually a young tree that Bob felled, and then he carved notches in it. And this is where he put his temperature measuring equipment, above the talus. And then he put some below the talus. And so I can actually put my measuring devices exactly where he put them. Of course, he only measured the temperature for 1 year. This was back when you had these rotating devices with a pen on a bimetallic strip, and you had to wind them up, and they lasted for about a week. Luckily, he was in the 10th Mountain Division and super fit, and he would just, all winter, he went in there and wound those things up. So amazingly, we have a year's worth of temperature, which is, I don't know if there's any other place like this, but he was prescient enough to say, pikas probably use this microclimate. So he not only put them above the talus, but he put them below the talus. And so I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll put these sensors in the same places, and I'll have to measure for a lot of years to compare with his 1 year and see whether his 1 year is out of bounds compared to my lots of years. And so here's what we'll see. This is what we did. Emily Monk helped with this one. So this is what we found. You weren't going to be too surprised. On the left-hand side, we can see in black temperatures that Bob Creer measured over a year, from July of 63 to June of 64. So they're high in the summer, dipped down in the winter, came back up high in the summertime again. And then the red, you see the about 12 or 13 years that I was measuring them by the time we wrote this paper. So we see they're kind of similar here in the free air for half the year. But then in the wintertime, it's much warmer now than it used to be, into the spring, and then in the early summer, much warmer than during that year that Bob had. And that's not too surprising. We all know it's getting warmer since I was born. But this was amazing. If we look at the shallow talus and the deep talus, the pattern is way more dramatic, and it affects much more of the year as well. It turns out that by deep talus, there's only a couple months when it's anything like what it used to be 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I just turned 60, so this is getting close to that. And we no longer have this really deep freeze that we used to have. And you're rightly wondering, well, this is one point on the planet, Chris. Is this, I don't know. I don't know if this is general, and this is something that another student is working on. She happens to be sitting right here. This is Irene. And she's putting her sensors all over the place in the free air and underneath the talus. And she's going to be looking at this relationship everywhere. And then I've been doing this for about 20 years. And so pretty soon I have a time series that I can analyze myself. I won't have to go back to Bob Creer's one study site. But we see this really alarming result that the microclimate's changing. And so often probably you've read things where like, oh yeah, climate's changing and everything, but there are microclimates, and things will just retreat to the microclimate that they need. Well, what if the microclimate's changing? And it is at this spot. So it's another thing that keeps me up at night. Reason I put this on again was just say, if taluses no longer experience a deep freeze during the winter, they might not maintain cool summer temperatures. Another ace up the sleeve that pikas have. This guy, the yellow-bellied marmot. So pikas live with marmots almost always. This was a Fulbright student I had working with me. And with his right hand, he is pointing to a marmot den. And with his left, he is pointing to a pika hay pile. And you can see how closely they are allied here. Here's the marmot. Here's a marmot communing with one of my tagged pikas. They just live really closely together. And so why? Here's a little series from a wildlife camera. And what I've got here is a marmot, hungry marmot coming out in the morning from its den, which is like, there's a hole here and a hole here. That's a marmot den. And later in the morning, it's going back. And if we look really closely, there's a little bit of grass in its mouth and it's going back in the den. And later in at the same place, later in the day, here's a little pika butt. Pika's looking in the den. And here we can just barely see the butt disappearing as it goes into the marmot den. I have seen many times females have their babies in the marmot dens. So pika babies being born in marmot dens. Well, that seems reasonable. If a marmot isn't going to eat them, it doesn't really like doing that. Then the marmot is actually really good at chasing off the worst predators of the pika. An adult marmot has no trouble chasing off a weasel. The weasels get the juveniles for sure, but the adult marmots are pretty bad. And so the pikas are probably a little more safe. They're in the marmot den. That's one thing. Also, marmots, they see you coming from miles away, right? They're chirping, especially if you have a dog with you, right? And pikas are a little more myopic, they're smaller. The rocks are bigger for them. It's kind of like they're in a city with buildings around. They don't see stuff far away as well as a marmot does. So they can benefit in a lot of ways from just having that community. This is not a cigar. Have you seen pikas doing this? Anybody? They do it all the time, especially when you're looking. It's kind of almost like, oh, the default. Well, if a person's there and I'm a little nervous about going too far out in the meadow, I'll just collect some marmot scat because I got to use my time wisely. Make hay while the sun shines. So they're doing this. They're collecting marmot scat. Why? In my 36 years of staring at pikas all summer long, I have only once seen a pika look like it was eating that. It was a juvenile pika and it was right by me. It was really nervous. I think it was just like, I don't know. I don't know if they eat it, but they collect it and they put it in their hay piles. And of course, rabbits, hares, and pikas, as I mentioned, run their food through twice. So they have, coprophagy for maximum nutrient extraction. And it looks like this. Pika, oops, oh my goodness, we don't want that. Pika is just sitting there happily. And then it looks like it grabs a flea off its belly. It takes about 1 second, and then it's kind of chewing happily. And that's what it's doing, eating what they call the cecal feces. But this is an old pika hay pile here. And very often when you see an old hay pile, what's left is the marmot scat. The marmots do not come and poop in the hay pile. Never once seen that. The pikas carry the poop one at a time, and they put it in the hay pile, and then they don't eat it. And that's why it's still there when you come back and everything's eaten out of the pile. Well, we're figuring out now several ways to try to prove that they don't eat it. But we'll see. We're studying that. If pikas do it, it must be important, right? So now what's going on in Mongolia? I happen to get to go over there to study pikas, so I take you with me. This was our yurt. It was wonderful. Here's a Mongolian pika. It looks just like our pikas, only about 1.5 times as big. This is Pallas's pika here. Here's another one. During the day, they just hang out under the rocks in the shade because it's bloody hot. These are pikas in the Gobi Desert. But under the rocks are amazing. It's nice and cool, and so they can just hang out. There weren't very many hanging out, though. I saw 8 in my entire 2 weeks there, which really sucked. But I did see some. Look, there's a little cutie in there. Yeah. Look at this one. These rocks are like pancakes, and there's a pika in between. Just hanging out there. You can get really close because they know you can't get them. So they're working the microclimate. And then they also build microclimate there. So this being Mongolia, you can imagine in the wintertime, it's a really long winter and the snow is often blowing horizontally. It's really cold. It's hard to keep any snow on the ground because it's windy. And the pikas there, they actually pick up rocks in their mouths instead of marmots can. They pick up rocks and they collect them. They use them. They put them on top of their hay. They make little snow fences out of them. A little snow fence here. And then the snow will build up on this side as the wind comes and the pika can like tuck in there maybe. That's my hypothesis anyway. They use them to fill cracks in the rocks. And then they grab sand that blows in the sandstorms that they have all the time. They're literally building their microclimate. It's so cool. And here I am, I'm happy as a clam. I'm like, oh, look at all this. It was really fun for a while. I'm like, oh, all this evidence of pikas. I don't have to look for hay piles. I can look for rock piles. And you can see that the pikas collected all these rocks. None of those rocks are out here. It's really awesome until you realize there were pikas everywhere here. I can tell because they're rocks and they don't go anywhere after the pika collects them. They literally are permanent, unlike pika poop. But there are no pikas anymore. So they used to be everywhere out there, and now there aren't any hardly at all. The only place they're left is by the marmots. There was one little marmot colony left, and that's where I saw the pikas. Why is that? Well, there's only one marmot colony because Mongolians like eating marmots. So that's one problem. But the main thing is they must be, again, either having a resource that's related to the marmots, or the marmots are dominating the microclimate that they need, and so the pikas are there next to it. I don't know. So that's what's going on in Mongolia. But what do they eat? I mean, we see pikas up in Rocky Mountain. They're covered there by meadows. There's lush vegetation everywhere. What the heck is this? Oh, that's pretty measly. I also thought of that when I was in Nepal. So I'm standing here below Everest. Here's Everest. Everest Base Camp is way down there, and in front of me is Talus. And there's pika poop all around. I never got to see a pika there, but I saw pika tracks in the snow, and I saw pika poop. I know they're there. They were just definitely not as abundant as I would have expected. There's hardly any vegetation, and that's a very harsh climate. This is the Himalayan snowcock. There was more Himalayan snowcock poop on the ground than there was vegetation. And pikas are living there. They're making it. It's amazing. What are they eating? Well, we also saw these lovely animals, the yak. Nothing like a yak. Amazing. We use them. We use them in lots of ways there. And also, humans exploit the yak feces. They take the poop, they lay it on the rocks and dry it, and then they burn it as fuel. And I kept warm many a day by the yak poop stove. It doesn't smell bad or anything. It's perfect for that. So humans are using it. And I then came across a paper that says, surviving winter on the Tibetan plateau, pikas suppress energy demands and exploit yak feces to survive the winter. So this study, they actually looked at two different habitats. One where there was a lot of yaks, and so there were a lot of yak poop, and another where there weren't very many yaks. And they showed that the pikas were doing a lot better here. Of course, it's just two places. But here's the kind of data they had. They were able to use molecular methods to see whether or not there was yak DNA in the pika's poop. Well, the pikas are just eating vegetation and there's yak poop on it. So of course they could be getting the yak poop by just secondhand, eating a leaf that has some on there. But you'd think that yaks would also get poop in their bellies if that's what was going on, because the yaks are also eating the vegetation. And instead what you see here is in the pikas, they all have lots of yak poo in their bellies, and the yaks don't have as much. So the pikas are kind of hammering on the yak poop. And if you look at the microbiome in the pika's gut and in the yak's gut, and you look at it at different times of year, you see that all the flora and fauna in the gut during the summer, well, taxa in the pikas is not really related to taxa in the yaks. It's just a big scatter plot. But in the wintertime, it gets real tight. The pikas have the same flora and fauna in their gut as the yaks have in theirs. So maybe they're eating yak poo in the wintertime to get past. And then I started thinking about Mongolia. I was like, wait, when I look at this picture, there is more poop on the ground than there are plants. I actually took pictures. They don't show very well, but there's so much poop on the ground in Mongolia. You can't believe it. They have, a lot of overgrazing. So they have all kinds of ungulates that are pooping, and maybe the pikas are actually depending on that somewhat. So that's one of the things we're studying. So then you come back to our landscape. Here we are on Niwot Ridge again, and it's like a garden. It's so beautiful, and it's so lush and green. And well, I kind of thought it was beautiful in Mongolia too, but this is kind of the typical Garden of Eden thing here. And this is a pika's hay pile right in under a rock here. And then this is the garden that it draws from to put in the hay pile. And this pika is still collecting marmot poop. It still collects it. Why? It's certainly not vegetation limited. So there must be some other benefit to collecting this poop. So that's another thing we're studying here. So I just like to show this picture. This is an undergraduate who was supposed to be trying to take data on this pika's behavior. And the pika was supposed to be running around and doing pika stuff. Instead, it was licking her butt for 15 minutes. I mean, literally, this pika is licking her butt. And this is my water bottle and this pika tongue, licky, lick, lick. It wasn't thirsty. They're going for your salts. People think they're, pikas are asking for their lunch. They just want to lick your backpack straps for the salt. So are they salt limited? Yeah, probably. I put a selenium salt lick out once, and the pika was at it 24/7, like licking that thing. I think I killed that pika because, it didn't do anything else. I had a camera trained on the salt lick, and it was just like, Anyway, one hypothesis for why this might be an important thing is we're increasing nitrogen deposition everywhere. And it turns out that nitrogen, when it comes down in the mountains, can actually reduce the amount of selenium salts that are available to plants and animals. And pikas might be quite selenium limited at this point. So that's another thing to study. I'll be studying all this stuff for a long time. I don't know the answers yet, sorry. And then there's the studies of microclimate. So the studies of micronutrients, maybe salts, studies of microclimate. And this is what Irie will tell you about maybe in a few years if you invite her back to talk. So her lovely climate stations with temperature sensor up high, shallow, and there's one deep underneath there too that you can't see. She has 16 of these stations around the ridge. And then another graduate student is going to be using acoustic methods to figure out hybridization, source length stuff, and also just to actually figure out the demography, because we can actually count the number of juveniles and adults as soon as she figures out the acoustic signature of an individual pika, so we can figure out how many there are in the environment. It's going to be so exciting. That's another thing we're doing. So that's it for this main part of this talk. And maybe that's all I have time for tonight. I know that you guys only have a certain amount of time, but I do have a video if there's extra time.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay, great. Let's do the video, and then hopefully there will still be time for some questions. Mike, are you on it?
He never did collect the elk scat or the hare scat.
Oh, you're at the end of it.
Didn't even collect
We need
the marmot
the
scat.
beginning of it.
But all three took the fireweed. Pikas store marmot scat in their hay piles. Not in large amounts, and we've never seen them eat it, but it's a common behavior, so it might be important. To understand the nature and specificity of this interaction between pikas and marmots, we're testing hypotheses related to nutrient subsidies and gut microbes. But we also just wanted to see whether we could get pikas to collect arbitrary samples of marmot scat, and whether they'd prefer marmot scat to other types of forage. So we set up a poo buffet. On the west knoll, we selected 3 pikas for this experiment. Near each pika's hay pile, we served up 7 fresh pieces of scat, including 5 marmot turds, 1 elk pellet, and 1 snowshoe hare pellet, along with a similar volume of fresh fireweed. Fireweed's a favorite pika forage, but there's none on the west knoll, so these 3 pikas might never have seen it before. We used a wildlife camera to record the results of each experiment over the next few days.
This pika didn't waste any time collecting all the fireweed, all at once. Within a few minutes of discovering the poo buffet, he had run off to his hay pile in a bundle of fireweed. You'll see him disappear for a moment, and then he'll run back across the frame with all his newfound booty. And then, in a little over an hour, he was back to check out the scat. He sniffed the elk scat first and decided no. By midnight, he was back again, and this time he finally ran off with one marmot scat. By 3 a.m., most of the marmot scat was gone, and he considered the elk and the hare scat once again. But nope. Finally, about 12 hours after we set out the poo buffet, he ran off with the last of the marmot scat. He never did collect the elk scat or the hare scat. The other two pikas didn't even collect the marmot scat, but all three took the fireweed. The two pikas that didn't like our marmot scat lived closer to a large marmot den and might have had their pick of marmot morsels. The scat in our buffet might not have been quite up to snuff. We'll keep trying. Along with nutrient and gut microbe analyses, we plan to plumb the poo buffet approach to understand why pikas pepper their pantries with marmot scat. Thanks, bye.
Okay.
So Chris, you'll take some questions? We have time?
Absolutely, I
Yeah.
have time. Yeah.
Who's got a question? Mike Smith? Oh, here, right, I always forget.
Yep.
So you were showing activity in the video at midnight and 3 a.m. Are they active?
Well, so it's cheating a little bit because I did lure them out with poop. But we do put cameras up and study their activity at night, and we'll be using the acoustics to study it a lot as well. And I have an honors student who just finished, and she'll graduate summa cum laude. A big study where she showed that about 15% of the pika captures that she got on the cameras were at night. 15%. That doesn't make them nocturnal. They're still diurnal. But they were more nocturnal than other diurnal species that we saw. Like we only captured about 3 songbirds at night in the whole 2-year study. But yeah, they can do that a little bit. And one hypothesis is that pikas are just going to shift their activity to night so that they'll be cool enough. But, most nocturnal animals have nocturnal eyes. It takes a long time to develop all of those attributes to allow you to be able to escape predation and things like that at night and to forage well. So it's not too likely that will really help. And she didn't actually, my student didn't find that there was any increase in nocturnal behavior along an elevational gradient. So she didn't find that they were more nocturnal at the low end of the gradient versus the high.
Sandra, do you have any Zoom questions?
Greg, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Greg Lewandowski, are you still here? I can ask it. Greg's question is there any chance that there are beneficial bacteria in the marmot scat that they acquire just by moving the scat through their mouth?
Yeah, totally. That's such a great question. So have you guys heard of a poop pill? Yeah. So, we use it. Humans, we use it. If you're a lagomorph living with rodents really tightly and coming into contact with rodent diseases all the time, it might behoove you to have the microfauna that the rodent has in order to ward off those pathogens. So it's very possible that it's just a poop pill, and literally just carrying it around is good enough to get inoculated with some sort of wonderful microflora. And that is another thing that we hope to be studying with using genetic analyses.
Another question here from the audience? No?
Paul,
Paula? Hold on. Wait.
you get to be on mic.
It's just in general, how deep do they go in the rocks?
Well,
I mean, they might be going deeper as it gets warmer.
Well, certainly in areas where there are deeper cracks, they might do better because they might be able to get further down where it might be cooler. If the talus is only 1/2 meter deep, maybe it's too warm. Irie showed in analyzing data from the Colorado Pika Project, the volunteer project that Karen was discussing at the beginning. Irie took data from Rocky Mountain collected by those volunteers and showed that it looked like deeper taluses were more likely to be occupied by pikas than shallower taluses. And so I agree, Paula, that that might be an important thing. However, I don't think they would go deeper as it gets warmer. I just think that places that have deeper talus would be more likely to be able to support pikas. And going back to the lava beds thing that I brought up at the beginning, Lava Beds National Monument out in Northern California, it's world renowned for its ice caves. They're old lava tubes that fill with ice, and then spelunkers go down in there and, you know, have a ball. Well, those lava tubes are losing their ice. And so that microclimate might be going away for them, so that, you know, what has been good for pikas may not be available in the future.
Sandra, any other questions from Zoom?
I have one, which is sort of what would be the effects on the rest of the ecosystem if pikas disappear?
Oh, pretty much it wouldn't matter at all. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Sorry. Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. Pikas are really specific to a certain habitat, so they're not going to be affecting, you know, all of the areas in the Alpine. However, they're one of the few small mammals that doesn't hibernate, and so they're available as prey throughout the winter. And it might be that they're important for that reason to other predators that don't hibernate, which is most of them. So that might be important. Another thing is that pikas act as what they call ecosystem engineers. They move vegetation from the meadows to the taluses, and so they actually start the process of succession of the taluses to start things growing, because they make a hay pile, it turns into dirt, they bring flower heads that end up seeding it, and stuff starts growing. And so literally they're part of that ecosystem. And they also maintain the meadows. Bob Creer, when he was studying that one area that I've been studying near Long Lake, he put out wire cages that are kind of like an upside down shoebox, just to see how much effect the pikas were having on the meadows during his two-year study. And then he left them there. So they've been in place for 60 years. And almost everyone is crowded to death with a Colorado blue spruce trying to grow in this little box. So clearly, if they weren't mowing these meadows, probably all be forest instead of meadow around this talus patch. So they're definitely having, you know, and the meadow really attracts other animals that come and graze. So, have this cascading effect that's probably limited in space to their habitat, but super important in their habitat.
I have a question. Because pikas use the same hay pile and territory, it seems to me, from generation to generation, I thought of it kind of along the lines of cultural inheritance. in pikas, and I got a kick out of that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'll say that I started studying a pika population in Montana in 1988 when I was an undergraduate. And I've been going there every year since. So it's a really long-term study now. And I know every single hay pile. And there are something like 400 in the canyon. And it's amazing. But every year, if I go to this location where there's like, this hay pile is always made of grass, lots of grass, no other leaves. It doesn't matter what pika owns it. That's what it is. Wow. This one over here is always fireweed. This one over here is always Senecio triangularis. It's just crazy. But it's not just because that's the only thing growing in the area. There's something going on where what you gather, it's certainly influenced by what's available, but really there's maybe a little bit more going for it. Like there's maybe something having to do with the microclimate and what's available. Like that means you need to gather this. And you could be, the great-great-grandson of whoever gathered it before. Hey, that's what you're going to get if you're at that one, and the next door neighbor gathers something different. So they're complex. As usually when you study something, you find the more you learn, the less you know. There's always more stuff. Oh, one really funny thing is in terms of that is pikas have different words for different things, maybe concepts. I don't know. I started in Montana because I was there every year. I started noticing that I'd hear a certain pika call and I would look for a weasel. And oh, wow. The other call, I look up because it's a avian predator sound. So that the weasel calls like this, it's real flat, And then the avian predator call I thought was like, kind of went up on the end, And I just naturally started learning to look one for one or the other. I was like, wow, so cool. Pikas have words. And then about 10 years later, I was like, oh my God, it's not a weasel or a hawk. It's look up or look down, or look down or look up. I learned it because I also started to realize that they make the flat call when I'm at the bottom of the talus, and they make the up call when I'm at the top of the talus. So it's more general than what I first thought. And 10 years from now, who knows what I will learn? Those same two calls probably mean something totally different. but yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool. I think area ecologists should have a long-term study so that they get some glimpse, over the long haul of something that they wouldn't get in their little three-year grant.
Sandra, anything else at your end?
We do. John from John's iPad, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I'm watching from California, and my experience with pikas has been in the Eastern Sierra every year in the Mammoth and Eastern Yosemite area, just as an observer, not as a scientist. But I was curious if the populations in your area, in say the Niwot Ridge and that part of the Rockies, are they, in terms of density of the animals, are they similar? I mean, how many pikas are there in a sort of successful area per acre? And is that quite different, say, in the Rockies compared to the high elevation areas of the Sierra Nevada? And thank you, by the way, for a great presentation.
Thanks, John. So good question, and absolutely not. It's so funny. You can only pack so many pikas in a patch. They are extremely territorial, and they're territorial from the minute they pop out. The female will usually have 3 offspring, and those 3 will start to fight over the nursery site from day one. They think they're each going to own that, and then the parents let them know otherwise and chase them off eventually. But they're very territorial, so each one has to have a territory, and every pika's territory is roughly 20 by 20 meters or whatever. It has to be about like that. So you're never going to have like lemming situation where you get this overpopulation. There's always a cap on how many pikas you can have in the landscape because of this territorial behavior. But if you have the West Knoll on Niwot Ridge is a good example of a situation where you can have a higher density of pikas because the rocks are interspersed with vegetation. And so a pika can have a hay pile here and it can go all different places to gather hay and come bring it back. Whereas if it's a talus patch that's just like, you know, monolithic talus and then bounded by a meadow, a pika can only go from the edge out into the meadow and straight back. And it can't do much else or it'll be crossing other pikas territories along the edge of the meadow. And so you get a situation where you have much lower density of pikas. They're only right at the edge of the taluses and you don't have a pika territory in the middle. It's a no man's land, you know, where you'd have to bring your hay across everybody's territory and go out in the middle. Yeah, so it's real interesting. But there's definitely a cap. Don't get pikas too close together.
Any other questions here from the room? One more, hold on.
I don't know if you can answer this, but I was just wondering when you were talking, are they monogamous?
Oh, actually, luckily, a friend of mine, oops, I'm having trouble with my hair, did the genetics and showed that at least in the Eastern Sierra area, she was up around above Lee Vining, basically, population up there. She showed there and then down at Bodie, which is a place down in a very high desert. Down at Bodie, the talus is really patchy. Up high in the Sierra is really contiguous. And she found that in both places, pikas are kind of optimally outbred, meaning they mate roughly with about second cousin, which is actually really good for most mammals because it keeps co-adapted gene complexes together and still allows for some mixing. So anyway, she found that, and the way they do that is by mating with roughly nearest neighbors, but you know, then your offspring have to kind of move off a little ways, usually because the territories are filled up. Every once in a while, there's an opening, and then maybe you'd end up mating with your offspring. It can certainly happen with pikas, but they aren't monogamous. They form what they call dyads, maybe, which means if you're next door, you're more likely to be mating with me. And I'll tolerate you a little bit during that time, but most of the time, just stay away. They really are not very friendly with each other. However, the Asian pikas, they live, about half the species that are in Asia live like prairie dogs. And so they're in matrilineal groups and they groom each other and they serve the same ecological function on the Tibetan plateau as our prairie dogs used to out in the prairies. And the Chinese government is trying to eradicate them just like we eradicated the prairie dogs. So really interesting situation where over in Mongolia, the Pallas's pika that I showed you, it actually has a place where you can study it from areas where it lives like a prairie dog to areas where it lives like our American pika in individually territorial talus areas. Really, really interesting flexibility there.
So does that mean there was convergent evolution, or are they?
Yeah, good. Next
There was a question. Wait, I have to repeat it so the Zoomers.
I can do that, or you go ahead. Yeah, so then the next great question is, was there convergent evolution? Are all the pikas that are like prairie dogs, are they more related than the pikas that are like talus dwellers? I mean, did you have an evolutionary split, a single one, or did you have more? What's going on? Well, it turns out it's just kind of random. They aren't two separate trees in terms of their lineages. So I think it's probably more flexible. And then you have this one species that's showing the whole range of behavior within over a few kilometers. So it's probably a flexibility that can happen. And so that opens up another interesting idea. What if we took our pikas and we seeded them down in the prairie and see if they would go into the prairie dog burrows and just be able to make a go of it? Interesting idea. However, there's plague. And plague originated in Asia. And it really is most prevalent in the pika marmot gerbil communities. And so it probably is also heavily affecting those here. but we don't study plague in the mountains yet. So that's another thing that we're studying. We're actually vaccinating the pikas for plague to see whether that increases their survival. And so far, it's hinting that it does.
Sandra, back to you. Anybody on Zoom with a question?
I don't see any more.
Okay, any last questions here? Yes, here, I'll bring you the microphone.
While she's going up there, I just wanted to mention, I have a few books up here, and these were made for about middle school age kids, and they're about the caribou. And the stories are told from a kind of a native community perspective. And these are free. If you know of an elementary age school child who would like to have one of these books, please come up and get one after.
I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on what you just said. I think I heard you say that we don't think we have plague in the mountains, but if we treat the pikas for plague, perhaps they're living longer. Did I understand that right?
You did. So what I do is I handle a few dozen pikas in a year, in a good year. Trapping pikas is not super easy. And so you end up not handling all that many. But I get vaccine and placebo from the USGS. And I give the vaccine to one adult, and then the next one gets the placebo. And I just reiterate that. Juveniles keep track the same way. The juveniles gets about half the dose. And so about half of the animals that I handle are getting the vaccine, and about half are getting the placebo, which is just the dilutant agent for the vaccine. It's the same kind of thing, delivered the same way. And the idea is to see, I am always looking at their survival over time. And so far it looks like it's actually significant that the ones that got the vaccine have been more likely to be seen the next year. However, my sample sizes are still pretty small. And so I'm not rushing to publish that until I get a lot more numbers. So we don't know, but we really have a good reason to suspect that a lot of the disappearances of pikas in the Great Basin or whatever, it happened right about the time that plague was coming across. So plague came into San Francisco around 1900, and it just swept like wildfire east to where we are here in about 40 years. And it's been dramatically, it probably reduced tremendous amount of the wildlife in the Western US. But at a time that it wasn't being studied heavily, small mammals were not being studied. And so we don't have much of an idea or a baseline of what things looked like before plague. It's very likely that it's circulating just happily in lots of communities here.
Including maybe in the mountains.
Yeah, and in fact, I would say maybe even especially in the mountains, because that's what it's evolved for. It literally lived in high elevations. Mongolia is like this, the central station for plague in Asia. So.
Sandra, a last call?
Chris, would you tell us what the book is about that you're handing out, so that in case any of the Zoomers want to check it out, you can.
Oh, Zoomers. Well, I don't know how the Zoomers would get it. So
just tell us what it is.
Counting on Caribou. And it tells the story of the caribou's ecology from the perspective of Native communities. And it's perfect for elementary school age children. And it was produced through University of Colorado Boulder through a series that we've been doing for a long time, put together by people in the LTER, the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And these particular books had some sort of a little printing error that has been fixed. But if you look really closely, you can find the place where they fixed it. And so they can't sell them in the store. So I just give them away for free whenever I give a talk. But they're lovely books, beautifully illustrated. And it's called Counting on Caribou. Yeah, so you can check them out.
Any last questions here? Okay, well, Chris, I want to thank you for a fabulous talk. This was just wonderful.
Well, thanks, you guys. Really good to see you.